Montana Territory, 1871. The train's whistle cut through the crisp autumn air as it pulled into Silver Creek Station. Owen Daniels adjusted his Stetson nervously, standing apart from the small crowd gathered on the wooden platform. At 25, he was younger than most men who sent away for brides, but 5 years of ranching alone had taught him that the Montana frontier was no place for a solitary soul. The endless winters chilled not just the body but the spirit, and he'd come to believe that men like him, quiet, hard-working cowboys with little to offer but calloused hands and modest dreams, weren't meant for companionship. Just survival. His ranch, though small compared to some, was finally turning a profit. He had a solid 2-room cabin, 40 head of cattle, and land that stretched toward the mountains. But every night he returned to cold silence, to emptiness that even his dog Buck couldn't fill. Still, he'd convinced himself that loneliness was the price of frontier life, that he wasn't cut out for anything more. When his neighbor's wife had suggested writing to her cousin back east, Owen had initially refused. What would a city woman want with a rough cowboy? But after another winter of howling winds and talking to himself, he'd finally scratched out a letter. He'd been honest about his circumstances, perhaps too honest, describing his modest holdings and simple life. He'd included nothing of his hopes or fears, just the practical facts a woman should know. Winifred O'Malley had written back with surprising enthusiasm. Her letters were cheerful, intelligent, and filled with questions about Montana. At 20, she was eager for adventure, she'd said, tired of Philadelphia's confining society. Owen had found himself anticipating her letters, reading them by lantern light, trying to imagine the woman behind the neat handwriting. But he'd kept his responses measured, certain that she was picturing someone more impressive than he was. If he swallowed hard, if you still want to go through with it after you've had a chance to see what life here is really like. Winifred studied him, her gaze direct in a way few Eastern ladies would be. Mr. Daniels, I didn't travel 2,000 miles on a whim. I came because your letters, despite their brevity, showed me a man of honesty and character. I intend to honor our agreement. Something in her tone suggested that honor wasn't her only motivation, but Owen didn't dare examine that too closely. Mrs. Henderson approached, a plump maternal woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. Miss O'Malley, welcome to Montana. Let's get you settled while Mr. Daniels tends to the horses. As the women walked toward the cabin, Owen caught snippets of their conversation. Winifred asking about the vegetable garden, Mrs. Henderson mentioning the quilting circle in town. He found himself hoping, despite his better judgment, that Winifred might find some happiness here. That night, after a supper where conversation had flowed more easily than expected, Owen sat on the barn's edge, staring at the star-filled sky. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd misrepresented himself, not through falsehood but through omission. He hadn't told her about the nightmares that sometimes woke him, remnants of the war that had driven him west. He hadn't mentioned how the isolation sometimes pressed on him like a physical weight, or how the neighboring rancher, Victor Thornton, had threatened to dam the creek that watered both their properties. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots on gravel. He turned to find Winifred approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. Mrs. Henderson is asleep, she said by way of explanation. I saw you out here and thought perhaps we might speak more freely. Owen stood quickly, gesturing to the bench he'd vacated. Please sit. She settled beside him, leaving a proper distance between them. There's something I need to confess, Mr. Daniels. His heart sank. Here it came, her regrets, her realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. I wasn't entirely forthcoming in my letters, she continued, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I didn't leave Philadelphia solely for adventure. I was escaping. Escaping what? He asked, surprised by this turn. An arranged marriage to a man 3 times my age, who viewed me as nothing more than a business arrangement with my father. Her voice grew harder. When your letter arrived seeking a bride, I saw an opportunity to choose my own fate rather than have it decided for me. Owen absorbed this. So you came here to escape a loveless marriage by entering another one. A small smile played at her lips. I came here because your letter was honest. You didn't promise romance or riches, just partnership, respect, and hard work. That's more than most women are offered. Your family, they just let you come. Her laugh held little humor. My father disowned me when I refused the match he'd arranged. My mother slipped me enough money for the train ticket. I have no family left in Philadelphia, Mr. Daniels. just as you have no family here. The revelation shifted something between them. They were both alone, both seeking something beyond mere survival. Owen, he said suddenly. If we're to be married, you should call me Owen. Then I'm Winifred, she replied, though most called me Winnie before I came west. Winnie, he tested the name, finding he liked the way it felt. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as a shooting star streaked across the Montana sky. Make a wish, she whispered. Owen closed his eyes, allowing himself, just for a moment, to wish for more than survival, to wish for a life where loneliness wasn't the price of his frontier dream. When he opened them again, Winnie was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. We should get some rest, she said, rising. Tomorrow will be a long day. As she walked back toward the cabin, Owen wondered if perhaps he'd been wrong about the frontier. Maybe it wasn't just a place where men came to be alone with their demons. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a place where new beginnings were possible. The next morning brought its own revelations. Owen woke at dawn as usual, intending to complete his chores before breakfast. To his surprise, he found Winnie already in the barn, attempting to milk Bessie, the temperamental cow who barely tolerated Owen himself. She keeps moving, Winnie admitted, frustration evident in her voice. Bessie's particular about who touches her, Owen explained, stepping into the stall. Here, like this. He demonstrated the proper technique, aware of Winnie watching his hands intently. In Philadelphia, milk comes from bottles, not cows, she said, attempting humor. You've really never lived on a farm? He asked, realizing he'd assumed she had some rural experience based on her eagerness to come west. Never. But I'm a quick study. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing slender forearms. Show me again. For the next hour, Owen guided her through basic chores, impressed by her determination despite numerous mistakes. She didn't complain when she stepped in manure, didn't flinch when gathering eggs from beneath irritable hens, and even laughed at herself when the water pump soaked her skirt. By breakfast time, they returned to the cabin where Mrs. Henderson had prepared a hearty meal. Winnie's cheeks were flushed with exertion, her hair escaping its pins, and Owen thought she looked more beautiful than she had stepping off the train in her pristine traveling dress. You're staring, Mr. Daniels. Owen, she corrected herself, catching his gaze across the table. Just wondering why a city woman would choose this life, he admitted. She considered the question seriously. In Philadelphia, I knew exactly what my future held, a gilded cage, children as political alliances, and social events where no one says what they truly mean. She gestured toward the window, where the vast Montana landscape stretched to the horizon. Out here, the future is unwritten. There's freedom in that uncertainty. And hardship, Mrs. Henderson interjected pragmatically. Winter's coming in a few months, and it's nothing like Eastern winters, girl. I'm not afraid of hardship, Winnie said with such conviction that Owen believed her. After breakfast, Owen needed to check on a section of fencing in the north pasture. To his surprise, Winnie asked to accompany him. It's a fair distance on horseback, he warned. Then I should learn to ride properly, shouldn't I? He couldn't argue with her logic. He saddled Daisy, his most gentle mare, and gave Winnie a basic riding lesson in the corral. She was a natural, quickly mastering the basics of guiding the horse with gentle pressure from her knees and subtle rein movements. They set out across the pasture, Winnie wearing a divided riding skirt she'd produced from her trunk, explaining that she'd had it made specially for her new life. The day was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage, the distant mountains sharp against the blue backdrop. As they rode, Owen found himself pointing out features of his land with growing pride, the spring-fed creek that never ran dry, the sheltered valley where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the rocky outcropping where he'd once spotted a mountain lion watching its domain. You love it here, Winnie observed as they stopped to let the horses drink. It's in your voice when you talk about the land. It's the first thing that's ever truly been mine, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. After the war, I couldn't settle back east, too many ghosts. Out here, a man can leave the past behind. Can he? She asked softly. Or does he just carry it differently? Before Owen could respond, a rifle shot cracked through the air, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Both horses started, and Owen instinctively moved his mount between Winnie and the direction of the shot. What was that? She asked, her voice remarkably steady despite her white-knuckled grip on the reins. Trouble, Owen replied grimly. That came from near the creek border with Thornton's property. They rode cautiously toward the sound, Owen scanning the tree line for movement. As they crested a small rise, he saw two riders near the creek where it crossed onto his property. He recognized Victor Thornton's broad-shouldered silhouette immediately. The other rider was Thornton's foreman, a surly man named Jenkins who was rumored to have killed two men in a saloon dispute down in Wyoming. "Stay back," Owen instructed Winnie. "Thornton's been trying to pressure me into selling. He controls most of the water access in the valley, except for this creek. And without water your ranch dies," she concluded, demonstrating a quick grasp of frontier realities. "Exactly," Daniels, Thornton called when he spotted them. "Just the man I wanted to see." Owen rode forward, keeping his movements calm despite the tension coursing through him. "You're on my property, Thornton." "Am I?" The older man made a show of looking around. "Boundaries get so confusing out here. Jenkins was just helping me survey where my dam might go." "Any dam you build better not affect the water flow onto my land," Owen stated firmly. "That would violate territorial water rights." Thornton laughed an ugly sound. "Water rights need enforcing, boy, and the marshal only comes through once a month." His gaze shifted to Winnie, who had moved up beside Owen despite his instructions to stay back. "Well, what's this?" Daniels finally found himself a woman. "Or did you rent her from that new brothel in Helena?" Owen's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Winnie's voice cut through his anger. "I'm his fiancée," she stated clearly, her chin lifted. "Winifred O'Malley, soon to be Daniels." "And you are?" Her refined Eastern accent and direct manner seemed to momentarily disarm Thornton. "Victor Thornton, Miss O'Malley, owner of the largest ranch in this valley." "How interesting," Winnie replied coolly. "I've always found that men who need to announce the size of their holdings are often compensating for deficiencies elsewhere." Jenkins snorted, quickly disguising it as a cough when Thornton glared at him. "You found yourself a spirited one, Daniels," Thornton said, his jovial tone not matching the coldness in his eyes. "Better hope she doesn't get tired of playing frontier wife before winter sets in. City women aren't built for Montana hardships." "I believe that's for me to determine, Mr. Thornton," Winnie replied before Owen could speak. "Now, if you've finished trespassing, my fiancé and I have ranch work to attend to." Thornton's face darkened. "This ain't over, Daniels. That creek will be mine one way or another. Might want to reconsider my offer while you still can." He wheeled his horse around, Jenkins following close behind. When they were out of earshot, Owen turned to Winnie with a mixture of admiration and concern. That was either very brave or very foolish. "Perhaps both," she admitted, her composure finally cracking as she took a shaky breath. "In Philadelphia, social warfare is conducted with words and reputation. I simply applied the same principles." "Thornton's dangerous," Owen warned. "He's run 3 smaller ranchers out of the valley already." "Then it's fortunate you're not alone anymore," she replied, meeting his gaze with steady determination. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that perhaps they needed each other in ways that went beyond their practical arrangement. As they rode back toward the ranch, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, Owen found himself reconsidering his belief that the frontier was no place for connection. Perhaps survival alone wasn't enough. Perhaps it took 2 souls facing the wilderness together to truly build a life worth living. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm as Winnie immersed herself in ranch life. Each morning brought new lessons: churning butter, mending fence, preserving the last of the garden vegetables for winter. Mrs. Henderson proved an invaluable teacher, her practical frontier wisdom complementing Winnie's eager determination. Owen watched with growing admiration as Winnie tackled each task without complaint, her delicate hands becoming chapped, her fair skin tanning under the Montana sun. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but faced each failure with stubborn perseverance. When her first attempt at bread resulted in an inedible brick, she simply started over the next day. When she tumbled from Daisy while attempting to chase a stray calf, she remounted immediately, refusing Owen's concerned assistance. "I can't be coddled if I'm to be a rancher's wife," she insisted, though she couldn't entirely hide her grimace of pain. On the evening before their wedding, scheduled for the following day when Reverend Henderson would arrive, Owen found Winnie sitting alone on the porch steps, staring at the sunset painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. She'd left her hair loose, the honey blonde strands lifting slightly in the evening breeze. May I join you? He asked, suddenly uncertain despite having spent most of the past 4 days in her company. She nodded, shifting to make room on the step. I was just thinking about how different the sky looks here. In Philadelphia, buildings and smoke obscure most of it. Here it's endless. Does that frighten you? He asked, genuinely curious. It should, shouldn't it? She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. All this vastness, this wildness, but strangely, it doesn't. It makes me feel like I can breathe properly for the first time. Tomorrow's the wedding, Owen said after a comfortable silence. If you've changed your mind. Have you? She interrupted, studying his face. No, he admitted, surprising himself with the certainty he felt, but my situation hasn't changed. I'm still just a small rancher trying to hold onto my land against men like Thornton. It won't be an easy life. Easy lives rarely seem to be meaningful ones, she replied. In the 4 days I've been here, I've learned more, experienced more, than in years in Philadelphia. She hesitated, then added softly, and I've come to respect the man I'm marrying more than I dared hope when I boarded that train. Her words warmed him in ways he hadn't expected. You're nothing like I imagined when I sent that letter, he confessed. Is that disappointment I hear? A teasing smile played at her lips. Disbelief, he corrected. That someone like you would choose this life. Choose me, he almost said, but caught himself. When he seemed to hear the unspoken word anyway, her hand moved to cover his where it rested on the wooden step. Perhaps you've been out here alone so long you've forgotten your own worth, Owen Daniels. The touch of her hand, warm and real against his, broke something in Owen, some wall he'd built around himself since coming west. Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle question more than a demand. To his amazement, she answered by sliding her hand to his cheek, returning the kiss with a sweetness that made his heart stumble in his chest. When they parted, her eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. Mrs. Henderson would be scandalized, she whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. Probably, he agreed, feeling himself smile, truly smile, for what seemed like the first time in years. But I reckon a man should be allowed to kiss his bride-to-be the night before their wedding. The creak of the cabin door had them moving apart with guilty haste. Mrs. Henderson emerged, giving them a knowing look that suggested they weren't as discreet as they'd hoped. Tea's ready, she announced, and separate quarters are still separate until tomorrow, Mr. Daniels, no matter how cozy you two are getting. Winnie blushed beautifully, but there was no regret in her eyes as she rose to follow Mrs. Henderson inside. At the door, she paused to look back at Owen, still seated on the steps. Until tomorrow, then, she said, her voice carrying a promise that sustained him through the night. The wedding itself was a simple affair held in the town's small church. Word had spread about the mail-order bride who'd stood up to Victor Thornton, and more townsfolk attended than Owen had expected. Winnie wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped alter, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Owen had his one good suit, carefully pressed for the occasion. They spoke their vows with clear voices, their gazes never wavering from each other. When Reverend Henderson pronounced them man and wife, Owen kissed her with a reverence that drew appreciative murmurs from the assembled witnesses. The celebration afterward was held at the town's only restaurant, where neighbors brought additional dishes to supplement the meal. Owen was surprised by the genuine warmth shown to Winnie, especially from the other ranch wives, who seemed delighted to have a new member in their small community. They've been betting on how long you'd last, Mrs. Henderson informed Winnie with her characteristic bluntness as they shared cake. Most gave you a week before you'd be on the train back east. I told them they underestimated you. I hope I continue to prove them wrong, Winnie replied, catching Owen's eye across the room where he was engaged in conversation with the blacksmith. The ride home was filled with a new tension, the awareness that tonight they would truly begin their life together as husband and wife. Mrs. Henderson had tactfully arranged to stay in town, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first night. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun gilding the landscape, Owen suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. What is it? Winnie asked, alarmed by his sudden tension. Smoke, he said grimly, pointing toward their homestead where a dark plume rose against the evening sky. Too much smoke. He snapped the reins, urging the horses to a faster pace. As they crested the final hill, Winnie gasped at the sight before them. The barn was fully ablaze, flames leaping skyward, black smoke billowing into the darkening sky. Buck was barking frantically, running in circles around the burning structure. Owen barely waited for the wagon to stop before leaping down, racing toward the barn where panicked whinnies could be heard above the roar of the fire. "The horses," Winnie cried, gathering her skirts and following him. "Stay back," Owen shouted, but she ignored him, grabbing buckets from beside the water pump. The next hour passed in a desperate blur of activity. Owen managed to free the horses from their stalls, leading them to safety, while Winnie organized a bucket brigade from the pump to the barn. Despite their efforts, the barn was lost, the flames too intense to control with their limited resources. By the time the fire burned itself out, leaving only smoking ruins, night had fully fallen. Owen and Winnie stood side by side, covered in soot, watching as the last embers glowed in the blackened skeleton of what had been the barn. "This was Thornton," Owen said, his voice rough from smoke and anger. "This is how he operates, destroys what you need most, then offers to buy you out when you're desperate." Winnie slipped her hand into his. "We'll rebuild," she said simply. "We lost all the winter hay," Owen replied, the weight of the disaster settling on him. "And the tools, the wagon repair supplies, the seed for next spring's planting." "But not the house, not the cattle, not each other," she countered firmly. "This is bad, Owen, but not insurmountable." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd been his wife for less than a day, facing disaster with more courage than he could muster. Her wedding dress was ruined, her face smudged with soot, her carefully arranged hair now a tangled mess, and yet she stood straight, unwavering. "This isn't the wedding night I planned for you," he said, attempting a weak joke. "Perhaps not," she agreed, her grip on his hand tightening, "but it's ours nonetheless." They retreated to the cabin, both too exhausted for anything but the most basic washing and changing of clothes. As they lay in their bed, Winnie curled against his side, her head on his shoulder. "We'll start rebuilding tomorrow," she murmured, already half asleep, "together." As Owen drifted into exhausted slumber, he realized that his core belief, that the frontier was no place for love, only survival, was being challenged by this woman who'd stepped off a train and into his life just 5 days ago. Morning brought both clarity and complications. The barn was indeed a complete loss, as was everything inside it. The horses, thankfully, were unharmed, though they now grazed nervously in the corral. Buck had appointed himself their guardian, patrolling the fence line with vigilant attention. After a quick breakfast, Owen and Winnie were assessing the damage when hoofbeats announced visitors. 3 riders approached, Victor Thornton flanked by Jenkins and another of his ranch hands. Owen positioned himself protectively in front of Winnie, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Terrible business, this fire," Thornton called as they drew near, his false sympathy transparent. "Barn fires can spread so easily. You're fortunate your house was spared." "What do you want, Thornton?" Owen demanded, not bothering with pretense. "To offer my condolences, of course." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And to renew my offer to buy your property. Seems like you'll be needing funds to rebuild, if you can rebuild before winter sets in." "We're not selling," Winnie stated clearly, moving to stand beside Owen rather than behind him. Thornton's expression hardened. "Mrs. Daniels, I understand you're new to frontier life, so let me explain the realities. Without a barn, without winter feed stored, your cattle won't survive the Montana winter. Your husband knows this, even if you don't." "What I know," Owen said coldly, "is that you're responsible for this fire, Thornton." "That's a serious accusation," Jenkins interjected, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Got any proof?" "I don't need proof to defend my property against trespassers," Owen replied evenly. "You've made your offer, we've declined, now get off my land." Thornton studied him for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Winnie. "I'll give you a week to reconsider. After that, my offer drops by half." He wheeled his horse around. "Come on, boys, let the newlyweds enjoy what's left of their honeymoon." As they rode away, Winnie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's truly awful," she said, "and dangerous," Owen added grimly. "He wasn't making idle threats. Without that barn and hay, we're in serious trouble." "Then we rebuild," she said simply. "How quickly can we get materials?" Owen ran calculations in his head. "The lumber mill in town could supply what we need, but I don't have the funds for that much material. Not without selling off most of the herd, which defeats the purpose." "What about neighbors? Surely others have faced similar hardships." "This isn't Philadelphia, Winnie. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and everyone's preparing for their own winter survival." She bit her lip, thinking. Your letters mentioned a friend who works at the bank in town. Could he help? Frank Miller, Owen nodded. He might arrange a small loan, but not enough for what we need. Then we'll start with what we can get, she decided. And I have an idea about the hay. Owen looked at her questioningly. You said Thornton has the largest ranch in the valley, which means he must have barns full of hay. What if some of it went missing? You're suggesting we steal from Thornton. Owen couldn't hide his shock. I'm suggesting we reclaim what he owes us for burning our barn, she corrected, just enough to get us through winter while we rebuild. Owen stared at his new wife, wondering what had happened to the refined Eastern lady who'd stepped off the train less than a week ago. That's a hanging offense out here. Only if we're caught, she replied with a determined glint in her eye. And something tells me Thornton wouldn't want to admit to the marshal that the hay he's claiming was stolen exactly matches what was lost in our suspicious fire. Despite the dire circumstances, Owen found himself smiling at her audacity. Mrs. Daniels, I'm beginning to think you might be more dangerous than Thornton. I'm beginning to think you might be right, she agreed with a smile that held more steel than sweetness. That afternoon, they rode into town to see Frank Miller. The banker was sympathetic to their plight, but could only offer a loan of 1/3 what they needed for rebuilding. Thornton's got his fingers in the bank too, Frank explained apologetically. I'm already risking my job offering this much. We understand, Frank, Owen assured him, and we appreciate it. As they left the bank, Winnie paused outside the telegraph office. Wait here, she instructed, disappearing inside before Owen could question her. She emerged 15 minutes later with a satisfied expression. I've sent a telegram to my mother, she explained. She may be able to help. I can't ask your family for money, Owen protested, his pride stinging. You're not asking, I am. And technically it's my money anyway. My grandmother left me a small inheritance that my father couldn't touch. She took his arm as they walked toward their wagon. Besides, this is what marriage is, isn't it? Facing hardships together, using all resources available. Owen couldn't argue with her logic, though accepting help from his new wife's family felt like a failure on his part. As if reading his thoughts, Winnie stopped, turning to face him. This isn't about pride, Owen, it's about survival, and beyond that, it's about not letting men like Thornton win by forcing good people off their land. Her passionate declaration drew the attention of passers-by, but Winnie didn't seem to notice or care. In that moment, with her eyes flashing and her chin lifted in defiance, she was the most beautiful thing Owen had ever seen. You're right, he conceded, taking her hand. We'll use every resource we have. The ride home was spent in detailed planning, what materials to prioritize, how to protect the cattle until a new barn could be built, where to store the limited hay they could afford. As they approached their property, Owen found himself seeing it with new eyes, not as a lonely outpost where he'd come to escape his past, but as the foundation of a future he was building with this remarkable woman. That night, with the practicalities of disaster recovery temporarily set aside, they finally consummated their marriage. Owen was gentle, reverent almost, as he discovered Winnie's body in the soft glow of lamplight. For her part, Winnie approached their physical union with the same determined enthusiasm she brought to everything else, her initial nervousness giving way to passionate engagement that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Winnie traced the scar on Owen's shoulder, a souvenir from the war he rarely discussed. Tell me about this, she requested softly. Sharpshooter at Chancellorsville, he replied, expecting the usual flinch of discomfort that mention of battle wounds typically evoked in gentle company. Instead, Winnie simply nodded, waiting for him to continue if he chose. The absence of judgment or discomfort loosened something in him. I was a scout, he found himself explaining, sent ahead to report on enemy positions. I wasn't supposed to engage, just observe and return. But there was a family, a mother and 2 children caught between the lines. Her fingers continued their gentle exploration, a silent encouragement to continue. I couldn't leave them there. So I went in, got them moving toward our lines. That's when the bullet caught me. He swallowed hard, memories he'd tried to bury rising to the surface. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 8, picked up my rifle when I fell. Stood over me like a miniature soldier until help came. Did they survive, the family? The mother and boy did, the little girl, he shook his head. She didn't make it. Winnie pressed a gentle kiss to the scar. That's why you came west. To escape memories like that. Partly, he admitted, but also to find something worth building after seeing so much destruction. I thought I needed to do it alone. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Owen shifted to look into her eyes, illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the cabin's small window. Now I'm thinking that some burdens are meant to be shared, and some dreams are meant to be built together. Her smile in response was worth more than all the gold in Montana territory. The following days established a new rhythm as they worked to recover from the fire. Winnie's telegram received a swift response. Her mother would send funds, but they would take at least 2 weeks to arrive. In the meantime, they needed to prepare for the approaching winter. News of the barn fire spread quickly through the small community. To Owen's surprise, help arrived in unexpected forms. The blacksmith's wife brought preserves and bread. 2 ranchers from the other side of the valley came with spare tools. Reverend Henderson organized a small work party to help clear the burned remains and prepare the site for rebuilding. I didn't realize we had so many friends, Owen commented as they served coffee to the men who'd come to help. Sometimes it takes hardship to reveal community, Winnie replied, passing mugs to grateful workers. The most unexpected assistance came from Frank Miller, who arrived with a wagon loaded with lumber. Anonymous donation, he explained with a wink. Someone who doesn't want Thornton running everyone out of the valley. Progress was steady but slow. Without sufficient materials, they could only rebuild a structure half the size of the original barn, enough to shelter the horses but not to store the amount of hay they needed. The question of winter feed remained critical. A week after the fire, Winnie's plan was put into action. Under cover of darkness, Owen rode to Thornton's most distant hay storage, a simple roofed structure on the far edge of his property where baled hay was kept for the outlying portions of his vast ranch. The moral implications of stealing weighed heavily on Owen, but the alternative, watching his cattle starve or being forced to sell his land to Thornton, was worse. He took only what they absolutely needed to survive the winter, careful to make it appear that wildlife might have damaged or scattered the missing portions. When he was waiting anxiously when he returned near dawn, the wagon loaded with precious hay. "No one saw you?" she asked, helping him unload their ill-gotten supplies into the makeshift storage they'd created by repurposing an old root cellar. "No one," he confirmed, "but this won't be enough if the winter's as hard as last year." "Then we pray for a mild season while we rebuild," she said practically. Their prayers seemed to be answered over the next week as unusually warm weather held, allowing them to make significant progress on the new barn. The funds from Winnie's mother arrived, enabling them to purchase additional lumber and supplies. Community support continued, with neighbors stopping by with extra provisions or offering a few hours of labor. Even the cattle seemed to cooperate, staying close to the homestead rather than wandering to the far pastures where they would be more vulnerable to predators or rustlers. The only dark cloud was Thornton, who made good on his threat to reduce his offer for the ranch by half when Owen and Winnie didn't capitulate after a week. His men began appearing regularly along the property boundaries, ostensibly checking their own fence lines but clearly intended as intimidation. "He won't give up," Owen warned as they ate dinner 2 weeks after the fire. The new barn was taking shape, with walls and partial roofing complete, and he'll eventually notice the missing hay. "By then it will be mixed with what we've legitimately purchased," Winnie replied. "He can't prove anything." Owen started to respond when Buck's frantic barking alerted them to visitors. Moving to the window, Owen saw 3 riders approaching in the gathering dusk. "Thornton," he growled, reaching for his rifle. "Let me handle this," Winnie said, straightening her apron. "Violence will only escalate matters." Before Owen could protest, she was out the door, standing on the porch with her arms crossed as Thornton and his men approached. Owen followed, positioning himself beside her with his rifle held casually but visibly. "Evening, Mrs. Daniels." "Owen," Thornton called, his false joviality more menacing than open hostility. "I see you've been busy with reconstruction." "What do you want, Thornton?" Owen asked bluntly. "Just a friendly visit to see how you're managing after your unfortunate accident." Thornton's gaze swept over the half-built barn. "Looks like you found resources after all. Curious, given your financial situation." "We have good friends," Winnie replied smoothly. "Not everyone in this valley appreciates your methods of expansion." Thornton's expression hardened. Careful, Mrs. Daniels. Accusations without proof can be dangerous out here where the law is flexible. As is evidence of arson, she countered. Or perhaps the marshal would be interested in comparing the boot prints we found near our barn that night to your men's footwear. Owen glanced at her in surprise. They had found no such evidence, but kept his expression neutral. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thornton's face before he mastered it. Inventive, Mrs. Daniels, but irrelevant. I've come to inform you that effective immediately, I'm damming the creek where it enters my property. According to territorial law, I have the right to use the water that flows through my land as I see fit. That's not how water rights work, Owen objected. Downstream users have established claims. Take it up with the territorial court, Thornton smirked. Oh wait, that would require a journey to Helena and legal fees I doubt you can afford. By the time you could contest it legally, winter will have set in, and your cattle will be either dead or sold to me at a fraction of their worth. Winnie stepped forward, her voice level despite the anger Owen could sense radiating from her. Mr. Thornton, I grew up watching men like you operate in Philadelphia. You believe wealth and intimidation make you untouchable. You're wrong. Big words from a woman who's been playing frontier wife for what, 2 weeks? Thornton laughed, but there was unease beneath his bravado. 3 weeks, she corrected calmly. Long enough to send detailed letters to my cousin, who works for the Helena Independent. He's quite interested in the story of how Victor Thornton has been systematically driving smaller ranchers out of Silver Creek Valley through intimidation, arson, and water theft. Thornton's face darkened. You're bluffing. The first article is scheduled to run next week, she continued, her voice gaining confidence. I also took the liberty of writing to the territorial governor, who, coincidentally, was a friend of my late uncle. He expressed particular interest in reviewing water rights disputes in this region. Owen watched in amazement as his wife, his mail-order bride of less than a month, faced down the most powerful man in the valley with nothing but words and what might be an elaborate bluff. You think some newspaper stories will stop me? Thornton snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. No, Winnie replied, but the territorial marshal and his deputies might, once public attention focuses on your activities. Wealthy men like yourself are particularly vulnerable to scrutiny, Mr. Thornton. Your power depends on maintaining certain appearances. A tense silence followed as Thornton visibly calculated his options. Finally, he jerked his head at his men. This isn't over, Daniels, not by a long shot. Actually, I believe it is, Winnie countered, unless you prefer the additional article I've prepared detailing your involvement in our barn fire to be published as well. Thornton's glare could have melted steel, but he offered no further threats as he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind. When they were out of sight, Owen turned to his wife in astonishment. Was any of that true? The letters to your cousin, the territorial governor? A slow smile spread across Winnie's face. The cousin exists, though he's only a typesetter, not a journalist. The letter to him was real enough, though I have no idea if he received it yet. As for the territorial governor, she shrugged. My uncle played cards with him once, I believe. Owen stared at her for a moment before bursting into laughter, deep, genuine laughter that he hadn't experienced in years. Winifred Daniels, you are the most terrifying woman I've ever met. Thank you, she replied primly, though her eyes danced with mischief. I learned from watching my mother navigate Philadelphia society. The principle is the same: identify vulnerabilities and exploit them without mercy. Owen pulled her into his arms, still chuckling. Do you think it worked? For now, she said more seriously. Men like Thornton don't give up easily, but they do recognize risks to their reputation. If he believes exposure is possible, he'll back off until he can find a less visible way to pressure us. Which gives us time to strengthen our position, Owen concluded. You're a tactical genius, Mrs. Daniels. No, she corrected, rising on tiptoes to kiss him lightly. I'm simply a woman protecting her home. Winter arrived with surprising gentleness that year. November brought cold but little snow, allowing them to complete the barn and secure additional supplies. Thornton maintained his distance, though his men were occasionally spotted watching the property from afar. Winnie's cousin did indeed publish a small article about questionable ranching practices in Silver Creek Valley, though it named no names. The implied threat was sufficient to keep Thornton at bay, at least temporarily. By December, the ranch had largely recovered from the fire. The new barn, though smaller, was sturdier than its predecessor. Their cattle were healthy, with sufficient feed stored to see them through to spring. Most importantly, Owen and Winnie had settled into a partnership that transcended their original pragmatic arrangement. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in their small cabin, Owen presented Winnie with a carved wooden box. "It's not much," he apologized as she opened it to reveal a simple silver pendant. "I had it made from a coin my father gave me before the war." "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her finger over the delicate engraving of mountains and sky. "I wanted you to have something that represented what you've given me," he explained, helping her fasten it around her neck. "A new horizon." Winnie touched the pendant where it rested against her skin. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching beneath the small tree they'd decorated. She handed him a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank except for an inscription on the first page. "For new memories for our future." "I noticed you writing sometimes, late at night," she explained. "You mentioned once that recording the good might help balance remembering the bad." Owen was momentarily speechless, touched that she'd observed this private habit and understood its significance. "There's one more gift," Winnie added softly, "though it won't arrive until summer." It took a moment for her meaning to register. When it did, Owen stared at her in wonder. "You're certain?" She nodded, a radiant smile lighting her features. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. Our child will be born in late June or early July." Owen moved to kneel before her, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "A child," he repeated, awe in his voice. "Our child." "Are you happy?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her question. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he replied honestly. "When I sent that letter months ago, I was hoping for a partner, someone to share the work and ease the loneliness. I never imagined this." "What exactly is this?" she teased gently, though her eyes were serious. Owen considered the question carefully. "Love," he finally said, the word feeling both foreign and perfectly right on his tongue. "I love you, Winnie. Not because you're brave or beautiful or brilliant, though you are all those things. I love you because you helped me remember that surviving isn't the same as living." Tears filled her eyes as she leaned forward to press her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I came west seeking escape and independence. I found both and so much more with you." Outside, snow began to fall gently, dusting the Montana landscape in white. Inside the small cabin, warmth and hope flourished as two people who had begun as strangers embraced their shared future. Spring 1872 brought renewal to the Daniels ranch. Green grass pushed through the thawing earth, calves were born, and the creek flowed freely with snowmelt from the mountains. Thornton had maintained his distance throughout the winter, though rumors suggested he was focusing his expansion efforts elsewhere in the valley for now. As Winnie's pregnancy progressed, she adapted her work accordingly, but refused to be relegated to indoor tasks only. Owen often found her in the vegetable garden, expanding it to twice its previous size or supervising improvements to the chicken coop. Her energy seemed boundless despite her growing belly. "You need to rest more," he admonished one afternoon, finding her mending fence with one of the ranch hands they'd hired with the improving spring finances. "I'm pregnant, not infirm," she replied, though she did accept his hand to rise from her crouched position. "Besides, the doctor said activity is good for both me and the baby." "Within reason," Owen countered, leading her toward the shade of a nearby tree. "Sit, at least drink some water." She complied with minimal protest, settling on the quilt he spread beneath the tree. "You worry too much." "I worry exactly the right amount for a man whose wife insists on rebuilding fences in her condition," he replied, though his tone was more admiring than critical. Winnie smiled, patting the space beside her in invitation. When he sat, she took his hand and placed it on her rounded abdomen. "Feel that, your child is just as active as I am." The sensation of movement beneath his palm never failed to amaze Owen. "Strong," he murmured. "Like his mother." "Or her father," Winnie countered, leaning against his shoulder. "I was thinking Robert for a boy after my grandfather, and Elizabeth for a girl after your mother." "Perfect names," Owen agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they sat together watching clouds drift across the Montana sky, Owen reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in less than a year. The lonely existence he'd resigned himself to had been transformed by this remarkable woman who'd stepped off a train and into his heart. His belief that the frontier was no place for love had been not just challenged but thoroughly disproven. The ranch itself had been transformed as well. With the additional hired help, they'd expanded their cattle operation and added more chickens and a few pigs. The vegetable garden would provide abundantly come summer, and they'd planted fruit trees that would bear in a few years' time. What had once been merely a place of survival was becoming a true home, a place where a family could thrive. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Owen found Winnie standing at the window, her hand resting on her belly as she gazed at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand behind her. "How different my life is from what I expected," she replied, leaning back against him. "A year ago, I was facing a future chosen for me by others, a loveless marriage to a man who valued only my family connections. Now I'm here, married to a man I love deeply, carrying our child, building something meaningful together." "Any regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. She turned in his embrace to face him. "Not one," she said firmly. "This life isn't easy, but it's ours. Every challenge we face together." As he held her close, feeling their child move between them, Owen silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought this woman to him. The frontier might be harsh and unforgiving, but it had also given him the greatest gift of his life, a partner who saw not just his strength but his vulnerability, who matched his determination with her own, who had taught him that true survival meant opening his heart rather than armoring it. "No regrets," he echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss as the Montana night enfolded them in its vast, star-studded embrace. July arrived with blazing heat and the imminent arrival of their child. The ranch had never looked better, fences mended, buildings painted, garden flourishing. Even Thornton had maintained his distance, apparently focusing his expansion efforts on the northern end of the valley. When Winnie's labor began, Owen sent their ranch hand galloping for the midwife in town. The hours that followed were the longest of Owen's life as he alternated between pacing outside the bedroom door and holding Winnie's hand through contractions that left her gasping. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her as the midwife prepared for the final stage. "Remember that," she replied through gritted teeth, "when I tell you this is the only child we're having." The midwife chuckled. "They all say that, Mr. Daniels, don't you worry." Shortly after sunset, their daughter entered the world with a powerful cry that immediately confirmed she was her mother's child. Elizabeth Rose Daniels had her mother's delicate features and, according to the midwife, her father's stubborn chin. As Owen held his daughter for the first time, staring in wonder at the tiny fingers and rosebud mouth, he felt a new kind of love expand within him, fierce, protective, and overwhelming. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled infant to Winnie's arms. "She is," Winnie agreed, her face radiant despite her exhaustion, "and she's ours." Owen settled beside them on the bed, one arm around his wife, the other hand gently stroking his daughter's downy head. In that moment, he felt a completion he hadn't known was possible. The war, the nightmares, the years of solitary existence, all seemed to recede before the simple, profound reality of his family. "I never thought I could have this," he admitted softly. "After the war, I believed that some men weren't meant for happiness, that all I could hope for was quiet and distance from the memories." Winnie leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now I understand that healing doesn't come from isolation. It comes from building something new, something worth fighting for." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You gave me that chance, Winnie. When you stepped off that train, when you looked at me and saw possibility instead of damage." "We gave each other that chance," she corrected gently, "and now we've given Elizabeth a world of possibilities." As the Montana night settled around their small cabin, Owen Daniels held his wife and daughter close, marveling at how completely his life had changed in the span of a year. The frontier hadn't tamed him, it had taught him resilience. But it was Winnie who had taught him that resilience without love was merely survival, and that true strength came not from standing alone, but from building something worth protecting. Outside, the stars wheeled above the Montana landscape, witnessing the quiet triumph of love in a place where only the strongest survived. And in that moment, Owen knew with absolute certainty that he had found not just survival, but a life truly worth living.